and welcome back to Ask an Ecologist. My name is Suzanne Simpson, and I'm an ecologist for Bayou Land Conservancy here in Houston, Texas. Each week, Thursday at 3 p.m. on Facebook Live, we take your nature questions and talk about all things outdoors. And this week, we have a good show lined up for you, I think. I'm going to start with some questions about frogs, and then we're going to get into one of my favorite and most complicated topics, which is the nuances of invasive species. I hope everyone that's watching is doing well and staying as cool as you can right now. It's about 100 degrees on my patio, the feels like temperature anyway. And it is hot. It is mid-August. It's about as hot as it gets here in Houston, and I'm looking forward to 6 weeks from now. All right, so let's get into your question. David Sharp asked, what sorts of predators eat tadpoles? Well, David, pretty much everything that can fit a tadpole into its mouth will eat a tadpole. So dragonfly larvae, other macroinvertebrates, birds, mammals like raccoons, larger tadpoles will eat smaller tadpoles. About 90% of tadpoles are going to be preyed upon. So, simple answer to that question is a lot of things eat tadpoles. It's a rough life out there for tadpoles. David's next question was, what determines when Gulf Coast toads, so Gulf Coast toads are a species of toad that we have here in Houston especially. What determines when the Gulf Coast toad comes to sing? We frequently have them singing by our backyard pond most of the night, but not every night. It doesn't seem to correlate with phases of the moon or temperature or rainfall. What kind of stimuli are they responding to? So the two most spot-on predictors for when a Gulf Coast toad is going to start singing are the time of the year and how wet it is. So after a warm summer rain, that's your most likely time that you're going to hear a big chorus of Gulf Coast toads, especially if there's been a period of dry and then you have a big summer rain. You're really likely to hear a lot of Gulf Coast toads chorusing around your yard or around your habitat. But that doesn't mean that it's going to happen every time. Keep in mind that the reason that frogs and toads are calling are to mate. And so if a toad is mated the night before or mated recently, it may be taking that night off. But your best predictors are going to be time of year for Gulf Coast toad. I usually hear them June through September, most notably in my backyard. And then after that first summer rain, when you've had that period of dry, they are loud, they are out there all night, and they're trying to make more Gulf Coast toads. So keep an ear out for that, and thanks for submitting your question. So our next question is what I am going to spend the rest of this episode on. And it comes from Natalie Freitas, who asked, is there a point at which an invasive species has been in the ecosystem long enough that they become native? So I really love this question, and it is a really good, really complicated question. I could easily go on for an hour trying to give you a proper answer to this, but I'll spare you. But in order to make my answer relatively concise, I'm going to be using a lot of terminology, and I may have to use some oversimplifications of these terminologies in order to make this answer make sense within the parameters of this show. So I just want to give the caveat that this is an answer that has a lot of nuance and that can be very subjective. But I'll give you my take on your question. So for those of you that might be less familiar, an invasive species is a species that has not historically been distributed in the ecosystem that it is in, and that it also, I'm getting Facebook messages, one moment. Okay, so it's been historically not distributed in the ecosystem that it's in. It is causing ecological or economic harm or harm to human health. And then another characteristic that is usually tacked onto that is that the distribution expansion was intermediated by humans. So humans played a hand in increasing that species range distribution. The difficult thing is that species range distributions have changed all the time historically, and usually it takes a long time, and humans are sort of speeding that process up, but it's not always cut and dry when human mediation has been the reason for a range expansion versus some other factor that didn't necessarily have to do with humans. And so scientists are left with sometimes a subjective task of deciding which species are invasive or not. Now, it's not always subjective. Sometimes it's very obvious, but that is not always the case. And I think sometimes we expect terms like invasive and non-native and native to have really cut and dry definitions. And according to the literature, those definitions change place by place. So in the United States, the standard that I've usually seen used to determine whether a species is native or not, especially here in Texas, is whether it was here in its distribution prior to European settlement. And so that gives us about 500 years or so, and on a geological scale, that is a very, very short period of time. And that's certainly not the only standard that's used in the United States, and it's certainly not a gold standard for international science. So places like Europe and Australia, they're usually looking at thousands of years, and just generally longer time scales to determine whether a species is native or not to an area. Another idea that's pretty popular is that a species is native if it's been able to establish predators, prey, and pathogens that provide checks and balances for its populations. So having checks and balances are really important to overall ecological health, and the thinking is that if a species has been able to develop these sorts of interspecies relationships, those coevolutionary relationships usually take thousands, if not millions of years to mature. And so the thought is, if these species have these sorts of interactions with one another, that species must have been in the ecosystem for a very long time, and we can call it native. Now, why does it matter if a species is native or invasive? This has a lot of significant management implications. As land managers, as ecological practitioners, and as naturalists, there's always an insertion of capital into land management of invasive species. And so what we classify something, whether it be native, non-native, or invasive, can be really important in how we end up managing the habitat as a whole. So a loaded term that you might hear to describe non-native species that don't seem to have an adverse ecological impact can be naturalized. So you may have heard that term before, naturalized species versus a non-native species or an invasive species. And I'll give you an example of a species that frequently gets that moniker of naturalized after I have a swig of my drink. So the cattle egret. The cattle egret is a wading bird that has historically been located in Africa, and over the last 200 years has undergone a massive range expansion worldwide. So it started appearing in South America, it appeared in North America, and the migration from Africa to those other continents is considered a natural migration. But who's to say that it wasn't facilitated, or their persistence wasn't facilitated by the creation of agricultural industries in those respective continents? So as humans moved into these places, we brought with us our grazing animals. Those grazing animals create good habitat that the cattle egret can take advantage of and have those commensal relationships with grazing animals. And so it can be argued that while the migration was natural, the ability for the cattle egret to persist might actually have humans may have a hand in that. But it is I've rarely ever seen a cattle egret referred to as invasive, and I'm not arguing that it should be referred to as invasive, with the exception on the island of Hawaii, where it has an impact on wading bird eggs. But the point is that this species, we've seen its range expansion in front of our very eyes, but we're calling it naturalized or non-native and rarely invasive. And so there is not a hard line for how long something is in a habitat for when we start to identify it as native versus non-native or native versus invasive. There is no, it can be very arbitrary when species have those monikers associated with them, and some of them can be pretty controversial. Um, this concept of native, invasive, non-native species has been part of the fuel for developing a new term called a novel ecosystem. And that is another topic for another show. I would love to go over that sometime. But I'll say this, as ecological practitioners, as naturalists, as conservationists, as people that just like being outdoors, we have to think more critically about how we manage our habitats than using sometimes reductive terms of native and invasive species when identifying their value. For example, an invasive species that is definitely detrimental to habitat in the Houston area is the Chinese tallow. And just because you have a forest of Chinese tallow, that still could have ecological value over a parking lot, or just a block of cement, especially if you can inject some management capital into that area to diversify the ecosystem. So we want to look at more than one characteristic than just, does this have invasive species? Well, if it does, we should just throw it out and do something else with it. We want to take a look at ecosystem services. Is it providing water quality enhancement? Is it providing recreational habitat? Is it providing habitat for other species that can help increase the biodiversity of the tract? And I think we do ourselves a disservice if we obsess over just, is this a native or an invasive species? Now, this isn't me arguing saying that we shouldn't be doing invasive species management. That is a part of our charge as good land stewards. But we, as land managers, have a limited amount of resources, and we want to make sure that we're using those resources as effectively as we can. So I guess my drawing a line under all of this would be that calling a species native, non-native, or invasive, there can be some nuance in those terms. And so we want to take a more holistic approach to land management rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater if we have an invasive species on our property. So I hope that sort of answered your question. I guess, I don't know. I don't think I could have answered that in a more concise way. There's a lot more that I would love to say about this, but I'll leave it there for now. Maybe I'll pick up that topic again later. Thank you for that question. It's one of my favorite ones that I've gotten thus far. Remember that you can submit your questions by sending us a Facebook message, leaving a Facebook comment, emailing us at info@bayouland.org. You can see all past episodes of Ask an Ecologist on Bayou Land Conservancy's YouTube channel. And I will see you next week for more ecology. Thank you.